In 1987, federal investigators discovered human remains beneath the concrete foundation of the Pine Hollow Baptist Church in rural Kentucky, with dental records confirming the identities of 17 missing congregation members who had disappeared over 3 decades. The skeletal remains showed signs of systematic malnourishment and restraint marks on wrists and ankles. Most disturbing was the discovery of surgical implements buried alongside the bodies, including bone saws and syringes containing traces of experimental sedatives that wouldn't be available to civilian medical practitioners until the 1990s. Church records found in a hidden basement vault documented detailed medical observations of congregation members, written in what appeared to be clinical notation rather than pastoral notes. Pine Hollow Baptist Church stood like a beacon of moral authority in the Kentucky hills, its white wooden spire visible for miles across the tobacco fields and coal mining settlements that dotted Harlan County. Founded in 1952 by Reverend Samuel Aldrich, the church quickly became the spiritual center for over 2,000 residents spread across isolated mountain communities. Reverend Aldrich arrived in Pine Hollow with impeccable credentials from the Southern Baptist Convention and letters of recommendation from prominent ministers across Tennessee and Virginia. His doctoral dissertation on spiritual healing through divine intervention had been published by the Baptist Seminary Press, establishing him as a theological scholar of considerable reputation. The Reverend's approach to ministry was methodical and deeply personal. Unlike other rural preachers who relied on fire and brimstone sermons, Aldrich emphasized individual spiritual counseling and what he called intensive pastoral care. He established a comprehensive system of home visits, private confession sessions, and residential retreats for congregation members struggling with personal problems. Within 5 years of his arrival, Pine Hollow Baptist had constructed additional buildings, including a residential facility for spiritual rehabilitation and a medical clinic staffed by Dr. Marcus Webb, a former military physician who had served in Korea. The clinic provided free healthcare to congregation members, filling a critical need in an area where the nearest hospital was over 60 miles away through treacherous mountain roads. Local newspapers praised Reverend Aldrich's innovative approach to rural ministry. The Harlan County Herald published a series of articles in 1958 describing Pine Hollow as a model Christian community where unemployment was virtually non-existent and crime rates were among the lowest in eastern Kentucky. State officials cited the church's social programs as an example for other rural communities struggling with poverty and social problems. The congregation included prominent local families, the Millers who owned the largest tobacco farm in the county, the Thorntons who operated the main general store, and the Washingtons, one of the few African-American families in the area who had been welcomed into the integrated congregation at a time when most Southern Baptist churches remained strictly segregated. Reverend Aldrich's wife, Martha, ran a boarding school for children from troubled homes, accepting students from across Kentucky and neighboring states. The Pine Hollow Children's Academy housed up to 40 students at any given time, offering academic instruction combined with intensive religious education. Parents paid substantial fees for their children to attend, drawn by the promise of moral rehabilitation and academic excellence. Dr. Webb's medical practice expanded rapidly, attracting patients from surrounding counties who were impressed by his modern equipment and innovative treatment methods. The clinic offered services rarely available in rural areas: psychiatric counseling, nutritional therapy, and what Dr. Webb described as experimental wellness programs designed to address both physical and spiritual ailments simultaneously. The church's financial success was remarkable for a rural congregation. By 1965, Pine Hollow Baptist had constructed a new sanctuary seating 800 people, a 3-story residential complex, and a modern medical facility with operating rooms and laboratory equipment. The funding came from what Reverend Aldrich described as blessed donations from faithful supporters nationwide, and grants from medical research foundations. Church services drew visitors from across the region, particularly for Reverend Aldrich's monthly healing services, where congregation members testified to miraculous recoveries from chronic illnesses, addiction, and mental health problems. These events were often attended by representatives from other churches seeking to replicate Pine Hollow's success in their own communities. The residential program attracted particular attention from social services agencies. Troubled teenagers, adults struggling with addiction, and families dealing with mental health crises were referred to Pine Hollow by courts, social workers, and medical professionals. The program boasted a remarkable success rate, with Reverend Aldrich claiming that over 90% of residents showed significant improvement within 6 months of admission. Local law enforcement held Reverend Aldrich in high regard. Sheriff William Brennan, who served Harlan County for over 20 years, frequently praised the church's role in community stability. Crime rates in the Pine Hollow area were significantly lower than in other parts of the county, and the few incidents that did occur were often resolved through the church's informal mediation process rather than through the courts. The Reverend's influence extended beyond spiritual matters into economic and political spheres. He served on the county school board, advised local government on social welfare programs, and maintained correspondence with state legislators regarding rural development initiatives. His recommendations carried significant weight in hiring decisions for teachers, social workers, and other public employees in the Martha Aldrich's Children's Academy received accreditation from the Kentucky Department of Education and attracted students from affluent families seeking an alternative to traditional boarding schools. The Academy's graduates frequently went on to prestigious colleges and successful careers, with many crediting their time at Pine Hollow for their achievements. The church's medical research program, overseen by Dr. Webb, received grants from pharmaceutical companies and federal agencies interested in rural health initiatives. Studies conducted at Pine Hollow contributed to research on mental health treatment, addiction recovery, and nutritional therapy. Dr. Webb published papers in medical journals describing innovative treatment protocols developed through his work with the congregation. By 1970, Pine Hollow Baptist Church had become a regional institution, with influence extending far beyond its immediate community. The combination of spiritual authority, medical expertise, and social services created what appeared to be a model of comprehensive community care. Visitors from government agencies, academic institutions, and other religious organizations regularly toured the facilities and studied the church's methods. The success story was documented in numerous publications, including a feature article in Christianity Today magazine that described Pine Hollow as a beacon of hope in Appalachia and praised Reverend Aldrich's integration of spiritual and medical care. The article noted that waiting lists for the residential program extended over a year, with families willing to pay substantial fees for the opportunity to participate. However, the very isolation that made Pine Hollow attractive to those seeking intensive spiritual care also created conditions that would later prove problematic. The remote location, combined with the comprehensive nature of the church's programs, meant that residents often had limited contact with the outside world for extended periods. The first documented disappearance occurred in March 1954, less than 2 years after Reverend Aldrich established Pine Hollow Baptist Church. Thomas Morrison, a 34-year-old coal miner struggling with alcohol addiction, entered the church's residential program after his wife threatened divorce. According to church records, Morrison completed his initial 30-day treatment successfully and requested to extend his stay for additional spiritual counseling. Morrison's wife, Helen, received regular letters from her husband during his first month at Pine Hollow. The letters, written in Thomas's distinctive handwriting, described his progress in the program and expressed gratitude for the support he was receiving. However, the tone of the letters gradually changed from optimistic to increasingly detached and formal. In his final letter, dated April 15, 1954, Morrison wrote to his wife, "The Lord has shown me a new path that requires complete dedication to His service. I must remain here to continue my spiritual growth and assist others who seek salvation. Do not attempt to contact me directly, as I am entering a period of intensive prayer and meditation that requires isolation from worldly concerns." Helen Morrison attempted to visit her husband at Pine Hollow, but was told by church staff that Thomas had requested no visitors during his spirit. When she insisted on seeing him, Reverend Aldrich personally assured her that Thomas was making excellent progress, but needed to focus entirely on his recovery without external distractions. After 3 months without contact, Helen Morrison contacted the Harlan County Sheriff's Department. Deputy James Crawford visited Pine Hollow and spoke with Reverend Aldrich, who produced documentation showing that Thomas Morrison had voluntarily left the program to pursue missionary work in Central America. The paperwork included Morrison's signature on a release form and a letter of recommendation from the church. The case was closed when no evidence of foul play could be established. Helen Morrison received one final letter, postmarked from Guatemala, in which her husband explained that he had found his true calling in missionary work and would not be returning to Kentucky. The letter included enough personal details to convince Helen that it was genuinely from her husband, though she later told neighbors that something about the writing seemed different. Similar patterns emerged with increasing frequency throughout the 1950s and 1960s. Congregation members who entered the residential program for various issues, addiction, depression, marital problems, or financial difficulties, would initially maintain regular contact with their families before gradually becoming more distant and eventually disappearing entirely. The disappearances followed a consistent pattern. Residents would write letters describing their spiritual progress and requesting extended stays at Pine Hollow. The letters would become increasingly focused on religious themes, while personal references to family and previous life diminished. Eventually, the individuals would supposedly leave Pine Hollow to pursue missionary work, join religious communities in other states, or relocate for new job opportunities that required them to cut ties with their past. Church records meticulously documented each case. Files contained intake forms, medical evaluations by Dr. Webb, progress reports from counseling sessions, and correspondence with family members. The documentation appeared comprehensive and professional, satisfying law enforcement inquiries and providing plausible explanations for the disappearances. Mary Catherine Williams disappeared in 1958 after entering the Children's Academy at age 14. Her parents, who lived in Tennessee, had sent her to Pine Hollow after she was caught stealing money from her father's business. The Academy's structured environment and religious education were supposed to provide the discipline Mary Catherine needed to overcome her behavioral problems. For the first 6 months, Mary Catherine's letters home described her classes, new friendships, and growing appreciation for Christian values. Her parents were pleased with her apparent transformation and planned to visit during the Christmas holiday. However, a letter dated December 10, 1958, informed them that Mary Catherine had requested to spend the holidays at Pine Hollow to participate in special religious services. Subsequent letters from Mary Catherine became shorter and less personal. She wrote about her duties helping younger students and her commitment to serving God through the church's mission work. When her parents finally visited in spring 1959, they were told that Mary Catherine had been selected for an advanced program that required her to live in a separate facility with limited outside contact. Martha Aldrich explained that exceptional students were chosen for intensive spiritual training that prepared them for leadership roles in Christian education. The program was highly selective and required complete dedication, including temporary separation from family relationships that might interfere with spiritual development. Mary Catherine's parents received periodic updates on their daughter's progress, but were not permitted direct contact. The updates written by Martha Aldrich described Mary Catherine's academic achievements and spiritual growth. According to these reports, Mary Catherine had expressed no interest in returning home and was preparing for missionary work that would eventually take her over. The Williams family's final contact came in 1962 when they received notification that Mary Catherine had died in a car accident while traveling to a mission assignment in Mexico. The letter included details about funeral arrangements that had already been completed and explained that Mary Catherine had specifically requested to be buried in Mexico among the people she had served. The pattern extended beyond individual disappearances to entire families who had sought help from Pine Hollow Baptist Church. The Henderson family, parents Robert and Linda, with 3 young children, arrived at Pine Hollow in 1963 after Robert lost his job at the coal mine and the family faced eviction from their home. Reverend Aldrich offered the Hendersons temporary housing at the church facility while Robert received job training and the family participated in financial. The arrangement was supposed to last 3 months, giving Robert time to find new employment and the family time to stabilize their situation. Friends and neighbors in the Hendersons' home community initially received regular updates from the family. Linda Henderson wrote about the kindness of the church community and the progress Robert was making in his training program. The children were enrolled in the church school and appeared to be adjusting well to their temporary situation. However, communication from the Henderson family gradually decreased. Letters became less frequent and more focused on religious themes rather than personal news. When concerned neighbors inquired about the family's welfare, they were told that the Hendersons had decided to stay at Pine Hollow permanently to serve the church community. The last letter from Linda Henderson, dated August 1964, informed their former neighbors that the family had found their true calling in Christian service and would be relocating to establish a new church in a remote area where they could better serve God's will. The letter thanked everyone for their friendship, but explained that their new mission required them to focus entirely on their religious work. Local law enforcement received occasional inquiries about missing congregation members, but the investigations consistently found no evidence of criminal activity. The missing individuals had apparently left Pine Hollow voluntarily, often with documentation supporting their decisions to relocate or pursue religious work elsewhere. Sheriff William Brennan maintained a cordial relationship with Reverend Aldrich and frequently praised the church's positive influence on the community. When families expressed concerns about missing relatives, the sheriff would explain that adults had the right to make their own decisions about where to live and what kind of contact to maintain with their families. The few formal missing person reports filed with the sheriff's department were typically closed quickly due to lack of evidence suggesting foul play. In cases where family members persisted in their concerns, Sheriff Brennan would personally visit Pine Hollow to discuss the situation with Reverend Aldrich, who invariably provided reasonable explanations and appropriate documentation. Dr. Webb's medical records supported the official explanations for the disappearance. His notes documented various mental health issues among congregation members who later left Pine Hollow, including depression, anxiety, and what he described as spiritual conflicts requiring intensive intervention. The medical files suggested that many of the missing individuals had been struggling with psychological problems that made them unsuitable for normal family relationships. Some community members privately expressed concerns about the number of people who seemed to vanish after seeking help from Pine Hollow Baptist Church. However, these concerns were offset by the visible success of other congregation members who had completed programs at the church and returned to productive lives in their communities. The church's reputation for helping troubled individuals actually served to explain the disappearances in many people's minds. It seemed logical that people who had hit rock bottom might need to make dramatic changes in their lives, including cutting ties with their past. By 1970, an estimated 120 individuals who had entered programs at Pine Hollow Baptist Church had subsequently disappeared under similar circumstances. However, the consistency of the pattern and the apparent documentation supporting each case prevented law enforcement from recognizing the scope of what was actually. The first crack in Pine Hollow's facade appeared in September 1973, when Janet Morrison escaped from the church compound during a severe thunderstorm that knocked out power to the remote facility. Morrison, the 17-year-old daughter of the missing Thomas Morrison, had been brought to Pine Hollow as a child after her father's disappearance and her mother's subsequent mental breakdown. Morrison managed to reach the highway and flag down a passing truck driver, who later described her as half-starved and terrified out of her mind. She was taken to the hospital in neighboring Bell County, where medical examination revealed evidence of prolonged malnutrition, untreated injuries, and what appeared to be needle marks from repeated injections. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, the emergency room physician who treated Morrison, documented extensive scarring on the girl's back and arms that appeared consistent with restraint injuries. Blood tests revealed traces of several pharmaceutical compounds, including experimental psychotropic medications, that were not approved for use outside of controlled research environments. Morrison's initial statements to hospital staff were fragmented and difficult to understand. She spoke of medical treatments administered without her consent, forced participation in research studies, and punishment sessions conducted in underground rooms beneath the church. Her account described a complex system of isolation, psychological manipulation, and medical experimentation that had been hidden from outside observers. Bell County Sheriff Robert Hayes contacted his counterpart in Harlan County to report Morrison's claims, but the case was complicated by the girl's obvious psychological distress and the seemingly impossible nature of her allegations. Morrison's descriptions of underground medical facilities, systematic imprisonment of congregation members, and ongoing experiments on church residents seemed too extreme to be credible. However, Dr. Warren insisted on a thorough investigation based on the physical evidence of abuse she had documented. The medical examination revealed that Morrison had been subjected to surgical procedures without proper anesthesia, including what appeared to be experimental brain surgery based on scarring patterns around her skull. Morrison's most disturbing claims involved her father, whom she insisted was still alive and held prisoner at Pine Hollow, along with dozens of other missing congregation members. She described a hidden facility beneath the church, where Dr. Webb conducted medical experiments on people who were believed by their families to have left the area voluntarily. According to Morrison's account, new arrivals at Pine Hollow's residential program were gradually isolated from outside contact through a combination of psychological manipulation and pharmaceutical intervention. Dr. Webb would administer what he claimed were therapeutic medications, but which actually served to make patients more compliant and less able to resist further treatment. The process typically began with legitimate counseling and medical care that helped residents feel they were making progress with their problems. However, as patients became more dependent on the church community and less connected to their outside relationships, they would be moved to increasingly isolated areas of the facility. Morrison described a tiered system where residents who showed signs of wanting to leave or maintain outside contacts were designated for intensive treatment. These individuals were moved to underground rooms where they were subjected to a combination of medical procedures, psychological conditioning, and pharmaceutical experimentation. Dr. Webb's research, according to Morrison, focused on developing methods for controlling human behavior through surgical intervention combined with drug therapy. The experiments were designed to create compliant subjects who could perform manual labor while requiring minimal supervision or care. The missing congregation members were being used as test subjects for procedures that Dr. Webb hoped to eventually market to government agencies, military contractors, and private institutions interested in behavior modification techniques. The remote location and religious cover provided perfect conditions for conducting research that would be impossible in legitimate medical settings. Morrison's escape had been possible only because the storm had disabled the electronic locks and monitoring systems that normally prevented residents from leaving the underground facility. She had been planning her escape for months, but had never before found an opportunity to overcome the security measures. Her account included detailed descriptions of other prisoners she had encountered during her years in the facility. Many were people whose disappearances had been explained as voluntary departures for missionary work or relocation. Morrison recognized several individuals from missing person photographs that had occasionally appeared in newspapers. Dr. Warren contacted the Kentucky State Police, who assigned Detective Lieutenant Marcus Sullivan to investigate Morrison's claims. Sullivan was initially skeptical, but agreed to conduct a preliminary inquiry based on the medical evidence of abuse and the serious nature of the allegations. The investigation faced immediate obstacles when Reverend Aldrich and Dr. Webb voluntarily submitted to questioning and provided extensive documentation refuting Morrison's claims. They characterized her as a mentally disturbed girl who had been receiving treatment for severe psychological problems, including hallucinations and paranoid delusions. Church records showed that Morrison had been admitted to Pine Hollow as a child with severe behavioral problems after her mother's institutionalization. Dr. Webb's medical files documented years of psychiatric treatment for what he diagnosed as early-onset schizophrenia, combined with trauma from her father's abandonment and her mother's mental illness. The medical records appeared to support the explanation that Morrison's claims were symptoms of her mental illness, rather than accurate descriptions of actual events. Her descriptions of underground medical facilities and systematic imprisonment seemed consistent with the paranoid fantasies that Dr. Webb had been treating for several years. However, Detective Sullivan's investigation revealed inconsistencies in the church's records that raised questions about their accuracy. Several documents appeared to have been created recently rather than over the years they purported to cover. Additionally, Morrison's detailed knowledge of medical procedures and pharmaceutical compounds seemed inconsistent with the profile of a psychotic teenager. The investigation expanded when Sullivan discovered that federal agencies had provided grants to Dr. Webb for research into behavioral modification techniques for criminal rehabilitation. The grants had funded studies conducted at Pine Hollow over a period of more than 15 years, though the published results provided only general descriptions of the research methodology and outcomes. Sullivan obtained court orders to examine the church facilities, but the search revealed only the public areas that had been seen by previous visitors. The underground rooms described by Morrison could not be located, and church officials explained that the building had no basement or subterranean levels. However, architectural plans filed with the county building department showed discrepancies between the church's actual construction and the official blueprints. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted by state police technicians revealed anomalous structures beneath the main church building that were not accounted for in the construction documents. The investigation intensified when Morrison provided information that led to the discovery of personal belongings from missing congregation members hidden in various locations around the church property. Items including jewelry, photographs, and personal documents belonging to people who had supposedly left Pine Hollow voluntarily were found buried or concealed in outbuildings. Dr. Webb attempted to explain these discoveries by claiming that residents often left personal items behind when they departed for new lives elsewhere. However, some of the items were wedding rings and family photographs that people would not normally abandon, particularly if they were voluntarily relocating rather than fleeing from problems. The case took a dramatic turn when Morrison led investigators to a concealed entrance to underground rooms that had been hidden beneath a false floor in the church's maintenance building. The entrance was secured with electronic locks that required special codes to operate, supporting Morrison's claims about security measures that prevented unauthorized access. The underground facility contained medical equipment, pharmaceutical supplies, and detailed records of experiments conducted on dozens of subjects over. The records included photographs, medical charts, and behavioral observation logs that documented systematic abuse and medical experimentation on people who were listed in official church records as having left the facility voluntarily. Among the subjects identified in Dr. Webb's research files were virtually all of the congregation members who had disappeared from Pine Hollow over the previous 2 days. The files contained detailed documentation of surgical procedures, drug trials, and psychological conditioning techniques that had been performed without the subjects' informed consent. The most disturbing discovery was a crematory hidden in a sub-basement level that had been used to dispose of subjects who died during experimental procedures. Bone fragments and dental remains found in the crematory matched dental records of several missing persons, confirming that at least some of the disappeared congregation members had never left Pine Hollow alive. Within hours of the underground facility's discovery, Reverend Samuel Aldrich and Dr. Marcus Webb vanished from Pine Hollow Baptist Church. Church staff claimed they had left for a previously scheduled conference, but investigation revealed that both men had liquidated bank accounts and sold personal property in the weeks leading up to the search warrant. The disappearance of the 2 men complicated efforts to prosecute the case and understand the full scope of the crimes committed at Pine Hollow. Without their testimony and cooperation, investigators struggled to determine how many people had been victimized and what had happened to subjects whose remains were not found in the facility. Kentucky State Police established a task force to investigate what became known as the Pine Hollow case, but the investigation was hampered by the destruction of key evidence. Before fleeing, Aldrich and Webb had incinerated most of the church's administrative records and medical files, leaving investigators with incomplete information about the residential programs and their participants. The federal agencies that had funded Dr. Webb's research initially claimed no knowledge of the illegal activities conducted at Pine Hollow. However, internal documents obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests later revealed that several government officials had received reports describing questionable research practices, but had failed to investigate the allegations. The Central Intelligence Agency acknowledged providing grants to Dr. Webb through a program designed to study enhanced interrogation techniques and behavior modification research. Agency officials claimed that they had been assured the research was conducted with proper ethical oversight and participant consent, though no documentation of such oversight could be produced. The Department of Defense admitted funding studies on psychological resilience training and stress inoculation procedures conducted at Pine Hollow, but denied knowledge that the research involved non-consensual human experimentation. Military officials claimed that their contracts with Dr. Webb specifically required compliance with ethical research standards. Pharmaceutical companies that had provided experimental drugs to Dr. Webb's research program claimed they believed the substances were being used in legitimate clinical trials, with proper participant consent and institutional review board approval. However, investigation revealed that no such oversight mechanisms had ever existed at Pine Hollow. The Kentucky Attorney General's office filed charges against Aldrich and Webb in absentia, including multiple counts of murder, kidnapping, assault, and conducting illegal medical experiments. However, without the defendants in custody, the legal proceedings served primarily to establish an official record of the crimes rather than to secure convictions. Efforts to locate the missing men proved unsuccessful despite an international manhunt. Intelligence sources suggested that Aldrich and Webb had fled to South America, where they may have established new identities with the assistance of other individuals involved in similar research programs. The Pine Hollow facility was sealed and eventually demolished, but not before families of missing persons were allowed to search for evidence of their relatives' fate. The process was emotionally devastating for family members who discovered confirmation that their loved ones had suffered and died in the underground facility. Janet Morrison, whose escape had exposed the crimes, required years of psychological treatment to recover from her experiences. She testified before congressional committees investigating government-funded research programs, but struggled with ongoing mental health issues related to her abuse at Pine Hollow. Morrison's testimony revealed additional details about the scope of Dr. Webb's experiments, including attempts to develop surgical techniques for altering personality and behavior. The procedures had resulted in permanent brain damage for many subjects, leaving them unable to function independently or communicate effectively about their experiences. The congressional hearings produced extensive documentation of unethical research practices funded by government agencies, but resulted in few significant policy changes. Officials testified that existing oversight mechanisms were adequate and that the Pine Hollow case represented an isolated incident rather than a systemic problem. Families of Pine Hollow victims filed lawsuits against the federal agencies that had funded the research, but most cases were dismissed on grounds of sovereign immunity or settled for undisclosed amounts with confidentiality agreements that prevented public discussion of the government's role in funding the illegal experiment. The few survivors found in the underground facility required extensive medical and psychological treatment, but most were too severely damaged to provide coherent testimony about their experiences. Many had been subjected to experimental brain surgery that left them with significant cognitive impairments and memory loss. Local law enforcement officials who had failed to investigate the disappearances faced criticism, but no formal sanctions. Sheriff William Brennan retired early and refused to discuss his interactions with Pine Hollow, claiming that he had relied on information provided by church officials and had no reason to suspect criminal activity. The destruction of church records made it impossible to determine the exact number of victims or to identify all the people who had disappeared from Pine Hollow over the years. Investigators estimated that between 300 and 500 individuals had participated in residential programs at the church, but could only account for a fraction of those people. The case exposed significant gaps in oversight of religious institutions and medical research facilities, but efforts to implement stronger regulatory measures met with resistance from religious freedom advocates and research organizations. Critics argued that increased oversight would interfere with legitimate religious activities and scientific research. Media coverage of the Pine Hollow case diminished rapidly after the initial revelations, partly due to the complexity of the story and the difficulty of verifying specific details without cooperation from the principal defendants. The case became a footnote in discussions of research ethics rather than a major scandal that prompted systematic reforms. The remote location where Pine Hollow Baptist Church once stood remains largely abandoned. Local residents rarely discuss the case, and many prefer to avoid the area entirely. The few people willing to talk about Pine Hollow express lingering fears that other similar operations may exist in isolated communities throughout rural America. Government documents related to the Pine Hollow case remain heavily redacted, with officials citing national security concerns and ongoing intelligence operations. Researchers attempting to study the case have been unable to access key files that might reveal the full extent of government involvement in funding the illegal experiments. The lasting impact of Pine Hollow extends beyond the immediate victims to include the broader erosion of trust in institutions that are supposed to protect vulnerable populations. The case demonstrated how respected organizations can exploit their authority to commit systematic abuse while maintaining public facades of respectability and service. Questions persist about whether Aldrich and Webb received assistance from government agencies in fleeing the country and establishing new identities. Some investigators believe that the men's knowledge of classified research programs made them valuable assets who were protected rather than prosecuted. The Pine Hollow case remains officially unsolved, with the principal defendants still at large and many victims never identified or accounted for. The incomplete investigation serves as a reminder of how institutional failures can enable systematic abuse and prevent justice for victims of crimes committed under the cover of religious or scientific authority. The families of Pine Hollow victims continue to seek answers about what happened to their relatives and who was responsible for enabling the crimes. Their efforts are complicated by government secrecy, destroyed records, and the passage of time that has eliminated many potential witnesses and sources of evidence. The case stands as a testament to the vulnerability of isolated communities and marginalized populations to exploitation by individuals who abuse positions of trust and authority. It also demonstrates how the intersection of religious institutions, medical research, and government funding can create conditions that enable systematic human rights violations while maintaining plausible deniability for all parties involved. Today, the Pine Hollow case is remembered primarily by researchers studying the history of unethical human experimentation and by family members still searching for answers about their missing. The broader lessons about institutional accountability and the protection of vulnerable populations remain largely unlearned, leaving similar communities at risk for future exploitation. If this story affected you deeply, if you stayed until the end, it's because you understand that these hidden truths need to be brought into the light. Leave a comment with the city you're watching from. We want to know how far these forgotten stories are reaching, and subscribe to the channel. There are many other cases the world tried to bury, but we keep digging them up.